Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, one of the final sessions on day one of the Humanitarian Leaders Conference. It's my pleasure to be hosting this session. My name is Melanie Book. I work at the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership as the Humanitarian Foresight and Policy Analyst. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting while we're meeting virtually. Many of us will be on the lands that are traditionally owned by First Nations people. For me, in my little patch of Melbourne here in Australia, that is the Bunwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We have a really exciting discussion for you this evening or afternoon or morning, depending where you are in the time zones. Before I introduce our speakers, though, just a couple of housekeeping matters. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present. We'll have the opportunity to have a couple of questions after each presentation, and then also at the end we'll finish up with a bit more of a panel discussion and questions. So I would really encourage you to engage in the session. I am able to keep an eye on both the chat and the questions that you're submitting through the platform, and we'll be able to provide those to the speakers. So really looking for your comments and engagement in the session as we go. So without further ado, we'll kick off the session this evening. I would like to firstly introduce you to Dr. Gemma Houldey. Gemma is an independent researcher, advisor and facilitator on wellbeing and organisational change in the aid sector. She's worked for over 15 years on human rights and humanitarian programs, mainly in East Africa and Palestine. In 2019, she completed her PhD from the University of Sussex, which investigated stress among national and international aid workers in Kenya. Her book, The Vulnerable Humanitarian, Ending Burnout Culture in the Aid Sector, will be published in 2021. So, Gemma, wonderful to have you joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and it's really wonderful to be here. So I'm going to be discussing making staff wellbeing and anti-racist, anti-colonial endeavour. And as we were just saying, this is really based on a book that I've written that will be out later this year, entitled The Vulnerable Humanitarian, Ending Burnout Culture in the Aid Sector. And that draws on my doctoral research in Kenya, investigating stress and wellbeing among aid workers there, national and international staff. And it also draws on my own experience within the sector, working on mainly human rights and humanitarian programs, and my own burnout and recovery. And I would say that the important thing to say for me is that part of my own healing from burnout was actually to acknowledge my own power and privilege, and to explore ways to unlearn my social conditioning around my own privilege. And this has taken a lot of inner work, a lot of contemplative practice, and a lot of deep listening to others. And it's an ongoing process. I'm still learning. So what I'm going to be sharing today are some of the findings from my book, some of the recommendations on why a collective and systemic approach to stress and wellbeing is important. I'm going to be touching on the meaning of inclusion and its relationship to wellbeing. And I will be sharing with you guideposts from the book for anti-racist, decolonial approaches to staff wellbeing, and recommendations for inclusive feminist practices for self and collective care. So without further ado, I want to just share with you here this quote from African feminist writer and practitioner Jessica Horn. And the point that she's really trying to make here is that if we're going to discuss stress, trauma, well-being within our sector and beyond it, we must understand the systemic causes. And this is particularly important when we consider in the humanitarian sector that the majority of staff are actually made up of national staff from the global south, many who have been born into situations of extreme poverty, war, violence and don't have the same benefits, the same opportunities to escape or to have a better life as a lot of their international counterparts from the global north. Also, when we consider wellbeing strategies as they stand within the humanitarian sector, they're often developed and devised by white people in the global north, which reflects the broader power dynamics within the sector. And also with those strategies of staff care strategies, it's often a one-size-fits-all approach and quite individualized. It's up to the individual to take responsibility for inner change. So there might be a counselling system in place, or there might be fitness classes or meditation classes. All of these are useful, but they don't really address the systemic causes of stress or burnout within the sector. And in that sense, they're kind of letting employers off the hook. And I think these issues have become particularly important in recent years with the establishment of the Aid To movement in response to sexual abuse within the sector, and the Black Lives Matter protests last year, and this further acknowledgement of racism within the sector as well. This is where we begin to realise that stress is not just about a one-off incident, or the critical incident, as we like to call it within the sector. It's often about ongoing marginalisation, discrimination and abuse. And these too often get silenced within the sector. There's no space to acknowledge these systemic problems. So just a few words about inclusion. It's become a bit of a buzzword in the sector. And you might have heard this phrase: diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I actually think this is quite a problematic phrase. It has a paternalistic air to it, because it's suggesting that there's always someone who is in charge of the party and someone who is in charge of the dance and inviting other people to it. And I think if we think about the humanitarian sector, we all know who that dominant group is that's in charge. And so inclusion should really be about ensuring that marginalised groups are at the centre of decision-making processes and systemic change, and ensuring not only that they are present or that they're represented, but they have a leading voice. And it's about dominant groups with more voice and power taking a pause to reflect on their own social conditioning and how these contribute to an unequal playing field. It's not easy stuff, but it's all part of how we cultivate an environment of self and collective care. And so when we apply this to staff wellbeing strategies, it means not only looking at alleviating the stress that arises from, say, the critical incident, but at the organisational culture, systems and practices that make people feel excluded, unwell and unhappy. So this is what I support people to do through my own work with different organisations, but also in the recommendations in the book. So I'm going to be presenting some of the guideposts on assessing your organisational culture. And this will be followed up by a 4-step integral process of self and collective care that is aimed at helping you answer some of these thorny questions that are often avoided within the everyday workspace of the humanitarian sector. So I'm going to rush through these. Do feel free to ask some questions about them afterwards. And obviously there's more in the actual book as well. So one of the guideposts that I discuss in the book is how to level the playing field with how staff are recruited, trained and rewarded. And this is recognising that it still remains the case that it's often white expats from the global north who are favoured right at the start in terms of their expertise and their experience when it comes to recruitment, but also then how they're rewarded, how they're compensated, and indeed how they are protected. And I think we'd all agree that in light of current circumstances, if certainly not before, that local staff need exactly these sorts of protections too, given the pandemic, given the greater dependence on local staff at the moment, and the need for them to be rewarded and recognised for the work that they're doing within the international, I'm talking within the international sphere. So this is really about reassessing your reward system, your compensation system, and indeed how people are recruited in the first place. I'm going to move straight on to the next point. Rethinking leadership and hierarchy. And this is recognising that everyone is capable of being a leader. It's just that some people have more voice and more opportunities than others. So this is really trying to question how decisions are made in your organisation. Who is it that has a seat at the table? Who is it that is involved in consultation and feedback? And if you're a leader yourself, it's also being vulnerable enough to ask, how am I doing? And to get that feedback from your staff so that there can be a more open conversation, an environment of feedback both ways. And so everyone feels that they have a say in what's going on, and it encourages more inclusive conversations. Also, the need, obviously, when we're talking about well-being, to make well-being strategies inclusive. And this, again, is to recognise that the stories that we hear around stress and burnout often do come from white people from the global north. And it's not to say that those stories aren't important. Of course they are. But we're not always hearing about the day-to-day realities of national staff working in contexts where they can't leave and they don't have the same kind of access to healthcare as, say, someone like myself. So some of the questions that I suggest people ask themselves are, what or who informs your understanding of well-being and abuse and trauma? And what informs the necessary well-being interventions and strategies? Also, do well-being strategies pay attention to the specific needs of marginalised groups, particularly if you consider the needs of women or LGBTQ plus people in different environments? And of course, this is really important when considering security policies as well and how these are developed. Also, do the wellbeing practices, images and resources you share with staff and colleagues promote diversity? Because again, I think a lot of the time the sort of recommendations around wellbeing are quite led with white Western narratives and ideas and imagery, particularly if you think of the yoga class or those sorts of things. It's often white people that we see in these classes, and we need to be asking questions around that, and also considering alternative wellbeing practices that come from people from the global south. This includes looking at spiritual traditions, religious traditions. I talk about this a lot in the book, of how this is not just some sort of separate bit of culture that has nothing to do with aid work. It has everything to do with aid work and what motivates aid workers, what supports aid workers. So we need to be considering that and seeing how we can bring those things into the workplace. So I'm going to move on now to kind of how really we can create those spaces to have these sorts of conversations, to be more open and more vulnerable, because ultimately well-being in the workplace requires us to embrace wholeness and vulnerability, to create spaces where people feel safe enough for truth-telling about their feelings, their challenges and their limitations. Spaces where these things can be openly discussed without fear of judgment or punishment. So this 4-step process is contained in the book. Again, there's not time to go through it in great detail, but there are particular feminist practices drawn from feminist movements in the global south to support people, organisations in self and collective care. Really, the main points I want to make here are the following. We cannot understand or show compassion towards the suffering of others unless we become more aware of our own suffering, spending time with it, responding with care and attention to it. And so I recommend in the book embodiment practices and reflection practices to support you in that process. Secondly, if we are to open ourselves up to new ways of working, we have to overcome our perfectionism. our need to get it right each time, our desire not to offend others, or to not discuss our flaws. And anti-racism work absolutely requires us to get things wrong, but to be okay with that and to keep on going. And so this is where we befriend our shadow, and there are exercises within the book to support you in sort of getting to grips with power dynamics, how they show up in your life, and how you can unlearn certain social conditioning. Thirdly, if we are to walk the talk on well-being, then we have to be clear on the values we stand by and reflect on the degree to which we're fully embodying those values. And again, this requires some shadow work, so recognizing where we may be falling short of and not practicing what we preach, but also getting really clear around our boundaries. What's our yes and what's our no on social justice issues, on the way that we treat each other, in the way that we look after ourselves as well. And lastly, for more open conversations about mental health and well-being, and about issues around power, gender, and race, we must cultivate spaces where people feel heard, where debate and differences are welcome, and where people are invited to put down their professional masks and to be real and vulnerable with each other. So it's about creating what I call psychological safety, where people really feel brave enough to speak their truth. And again, there are practices in the book around ritual, which doesn't have to be some kind of woo-woo religious thing, but bringing this into the workplace in a way that's an intentional practice to open up the space for conversations. And I also talk there about courageous communications, how to have courageous communications about power dynamics, but also about mental health. So I'm going to finish there. Obviously, do feel free to answer some questions, and I look forward to further discussion.